Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. I'm so excited to welcome back Dr. Benit Maru, one of my colleagues here at SSI Strategy, where we'll be reflecting on a prior episode we had with Dr. Michael Goldstein. We're going to talk about three key themes today, things that we did talk about with Michael, but really focused on being a chief medical officer, both in early and late development and across the development lifecycle. We're going to talk about different modalities and what it means to be a leader in device versus cell and gene versus biologics. How do we think about the differences in building a company and building your development plans? And lastly, and I would argue one of the most important topics is time and the critical variable that we're all trying to optimize and thinking about strategies to do so. So Benit, welcome back. So glad to have you here today.
Thank you, Kim. Good to be here. It was a great discussion, actually, that you had with Michael. So looking forward to it.
I appreciate that. Maybe to jump right in, one of the themes that we did talk about at the beginning of that last episode was this idea of being a chief medical officer or a leader in an organization in the early development life cycle, so working on first in human, versus that of late development and or preparing for commercialization. And often in the industry, we see kind of quote unquote early development CMOs, and then companies transition when they're moving into late development and they say they need a late development CMO that focuses more on med affairs, the medical community, et cetera, et cetera. Michael's had this really interesting blend of both of those experiences. And I think you have a really interesting perspective here as well, both with your early development experience, but also having spent so much time in your career in the HUR and kind of real world evidence space that is more traditionally focused on later development. So would love for us to start the conversation there and get your thoughts on what those differences are. And frankly, why it's so hard for people to bridge those different skills.
Yeah, and I do think it is important because, it is, I think some of it's terminology, because some people, depending on where they're coming from, what their backgrounds are, they'll have a visceral response to, I don't want commercial thinking in my development. So I like to think about it a bit differently. But I think Michael's right. The first priority is, can we get this approved? And then the second one is, can we get it out there? I wouldn't necessarily say, can I sell it? So to me, it's more about patient access. If this thing works, whatever it may be, and it can truly have an impact. So we should think about it with that patient lens. To me, how can we access the patient? So I do think it is difficult depending on what you focused on early, because there is a balance. There's a big balance between what the regulators are looking for and then what the commercial HTAs or reimbursement bodies are looking for as well. I think, the focus from what Michael was saying was, if there's too much commercial focus early, then it can be difficult because you may have confusing data. And then if it's too little, not only would you have a limited label, but you'll probably be, you'll have a narrower window in which you can get reimbursement. So I think thinking about it with the end in mind, I do think it's important. And I think it's appropriate to essentially just start as early as you possibly can, and then you would build on the narrative. I think it's important to understand what the different outcomes of the trials could be. So I do think scenario planning always helps. I know people will think, but that's too much effort for us to think about now. But you can always have high level, broad strokes. If scenario A happens, there'll be outcome X. So I do think it's worth thinking about in that way. Sometimes it is difficult, I think, for people.
I agree with that. And what I've seen is that many people, whether it's their own lack of experience in the late development thinking, having not gone through the efforts of launching a medicine to patients or whatever it might be,
yep,
it feels like there is a huge barrier to overcome to bring that thinking into, a phase 1 design to get a signal of something that's going to be meaningful. And or they're thinking that I will deal with that when I need to, when I get to late stage, phase 3, or when I'm talking to regulators. But one key point that you just raised is that it's about the narrative. Yeah. And when we think about a CDP or a clinical strategy, and you and I have had the opportunity to work on some of these together even, I think it's critical to sit down and debate, what are you trying to say? What is the story you want to tell a regulator? What is the story you want to tell the physician? What is the story you want to tell the patients and the payers? And you need to know that before you design any trials, because that's how your data is going to flow from your first in human through your real world evidence, and you're going to create a plan to enable that.
Agree. Couldn't agree more. And I think, one of the things that is extremely important to help level set is the target product profile. Having a TPP as early as you possibly can, that has actually nothing to do with, in my perspective, from the commercial piece. In early development, it is more about what is your North Star? What is it that we're aiming for? I think having that as your aspirational objective is extremely important. And then off that, you will then obviously have your base case, and you may have an intermediary as well. But I think level setting on what your North Star is, I think, is highly important. And that isn't utilized as often as possible. There are going to be things in there that you can't, fully complete. If it's like refrigeration, what needs to happen from a storage perspective, if the drug is still being part of development. But I think we have an idea of what the drug could do. So what is it? Yeah. What is it that you ultimately hope that this therapy could do, or the device could do, that would be a benefit to that patient population? And then the rest of the TPP gets filled out. It's an iterative process, just as your CDP would be. So I think having that TPP as an anchor, your North Star, is helpful. And I think that sometimes is the barrier, because if you go in early and you're used to being in early development from non-clinical to clinical, doing that translational piece, sometimes it's an icky word that is sometimes said that some people just don't respond well to. So I do think it's the narrative, but also how it's communicated internally as well.
Yeah. And that gets to corporate culture. It gets to the skills of the people at the table. Are they coming from big pharma and they have kind of a bad connotation with that, versus they've kind of been through this process? One thing that, as you were just talking, it makes me think of, we're in this really interesting stage in our industry. We're in September 2025. There have been the boom in biotechs is just increasing as new innovations are coming from other sources. AI is generating new molecules. People are investing in establishing new companies. But on the heels of it, people are trying to move as quickly as possible. And I wouldn't say they're cutting corners, but the idea of a TPP and a codified CDP, there's almost this visceral reaction that this is a paper exercise that we don't need to waste time on. Let's just write a protocol and start getting into healthies, or start dosing patients and doing something. And that need for action also means that we aren't taking the steps to do appropriate planning upfront. And so, are there trends that you're seeing, and or what is your advice in terms of retrenchment to the core of what we know we need to do?
So I think one of the key pieces is that, and you've said it, there's been a boom in innovation, and we've seen this for the last several years as well, with the advent of like Luxturna, Zolgensma and things. There's been such an innovation, and there's going to be more with AI. There's only a handful of people that have actually seen those through as well. So we have there's only a handful of people with that experience, but all this innovation is coming in. So we do need that support. So I think that's the first thing that needs to be acknowledged. I think the other thing that we should acknowledge as well is boards, and this is something that Michael said, boards will push for us to do more with less. And I do agree with one of the statements he made, was that we should always try to map what is the fastest path without resource limitations. What is it? So not just necessarily the fastest path, but the broadest path in terms of a label. So, there's two versions of that. So if you had no limitations, resource limitations, what would that look like? And then you would scale it back based on that. With that in mind, that's what then gets you to then think, okay, so we do need a TPP, we do need a CDP. If you can layer it all out and present it, it gives you a coherent story to discuss with your internal peers as well, whether that be CFO, CEO, even to the board. There's a reason we want to do it this way. And yes, we want to be expeditious. We want to get there as quickly as possible, but there has to be some method to the madness. And also, if you've got that plan, you've got whatever that chart is, your North Star, you can always then see, okay, well, if I do 1, 2, and 3, it may mean that I could miss 10, 11, 12, for example, as a step, if there's an accelerated approval that you're thinking about as well. So this gets to another thing that I think is extremely important that was said as well, is time. You will never get that time back. Spending the time to do some upfront planning, I think, is something that is extremely important, and that is lost in this world because everyone thinks we need to be quick. We can't be second to the market. I need to raise money here. I need to get whatever designation it is. Sometimes it does behoove us to just take a step back and just think and take that time, because time, again, that's one of the things that we're never going to get back.
Absolutely. We need to slow down to speed up in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
When it comes to actually treating patients. And we don't want to have to do 3 more studies later. We want to think through all of the permutations in advance so that we don't have surprises, that we can really prove what we need to prove. And then we can accelerate the path to actually getting to patients once we're in our development cycle.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that it's worth thinking about when you think about that, when you're doing a scenario planning or wargaming, whatever you want to call it, it's actually a really good way to bring people together as well, because you don't want people to think that you're siloed, you're having this discussion, you're doing this, and nobody feels like they're being brought along the journey. So, once you've got your plans and you've kind of got a few things, I mean, you could just do half a day workshop or a day workshop, bring in, the organization, and we've done this before and we've suggested to other people. It is actually a really good thing because you'll get lots of people's opinions and voices, but it's just team building. People don't feel like they're left out, and then it's actually good, to kind of spend that time with your colleagues.
Yeah. And the more you do that, also, the faster the team starts to actually try and work together. Yep. So to your earlier point on time being that critical variable, we are able to accelerate when the team starts to work as an actual team, not as a group of individuals.
Yep.
One of the other things that we spoke about in this prior episode that I think you're also in a really unique position to comment on is the difference in that development life cycle depending on the modality that we're talking about. We've spent a lot of time recently in the cell and gene space, but you've really worked across the board. And so can you tell us a little bit about, relative to that North Star, relative to early versus late development, what are some of the critical differences, but even more so the similarities in how to think about leading and developing an organization of these different organizations?
Yeah, so I think, there are some key differences which take up time as well, and planning for those earlier. Not that you can plan for everything, but it's worth thinking about, what is going to come out of left field. The key is, what are the similarities? You have to have safety. You have to have efficacy. They're the two things that are never going to change. You are going to have to navigate a regulatory pathway, whichever that pathway is, but you're never going to get away from that regulatory component. And what is it from a patient access needs perspective? What is that population that you're targeting? What are their needs, and how does that weave back into your development plan? So none of that, it should change. Doesn't matter what modality you're leveraging. The key difference is, yes, you do regulatory navigation, but within that navigation, there are some subtle differences. Understanding what the difference is when you're doing an advanced therapeutic product, because the pathways are so much clearer for small molecules and biologics because they've been around, for a long time. There's also good guidance around, leveraging data from different sources. When it gets to cell and gene therapy, you can't necessarily do a placebo-controlled study. You can't even do a crossover study, especially if it's a gene therapy. So there are some of those nuances there that we probably need to think about. The manufacturing has a big component. I mean, CMC is big for anything, whether if it's a drug or something, a biologic that you're giving to a patient. But when it comes to cell and gene therapy in particular, there are a lot more nuances around it. It takes a longer time for you to actually develop the therapy. There are challenges around that. If your master cell bank goes down, which we have had, then you start back at square one, which is very different to small molecule, which is, you get your chemicals and your substrates from most places, and then you can pull them together. The other piece that's the biggest difference is understanding what the safety concern is from an immune response because there are immune responses, as we know, to viral vectors. There's sometimes even immune responses to the drug that's administered, or the MOA, essentially. And the other piece that's important as well is sometimes you need to have immune modulation before you can even give the therapy. So you have to, immune suppress them. So there are some of those challenges, or not challenges. There are those differences, I would say, that are unique to cell and gene therapy. But manufacturing is one that I think can also just respond, can cause certain delays, which I think Michael spoke to as well.
Absolutely. So maybe just to recap a couple of the critical pieces of what you just described. In terms of the development of the asset itself, there's different considerations in an advanced therapy, in particular, what's going on with the patient throughout the process and how you're managing them very directly. And then, of course, worrying about the CMC and bringing CMC closer to the actual drug development than we probably have seen in more traditional small molecule development, because you hopefully assume that all is going well with your manufacturing, then you'll be able to get your chemical supply and all of those things are in place. You can't assume it at the same levels when it comes to some of these advanced therapies that have very complex manufacturing and control requirements than we're otherwise, supporting. The other area, I guess, to opine on is, small molecules versus advanced therapies are pretty far extremes. But then we think about biologics, we think about medical devices, which is a completely different landscape. And when we're thinking of those, of course, the actual development process is different in each one of those and what we have to do to get to a regulatory approval or otherwise. But what about how you even think about the team orientation, who you need at the table, when you need it at the table? I've heard a lot of individuals kind of talk about the burden of proof in a medical device happens post-commercialization versus for a drug, it happens, in your early phase 1, phase 2. And so, devices worried about real world evidence, drugs are worried about early safety and efficacy. I don't know if that's actually true anymore. Old adage, if you will, but it is a little bit of a different leadership positioning. So we love your opinions.
Yeah, so I agree and I disagree. That is what people do think. Yes, with a device it is like, so don't you get your 510K approval, for example, right? In the US, or you get your CE marking, and then off you go. And then if you want to go for a targeted indication, so I do agree with that. But do I agree that's how it should be? No, because I think you should be thinking about what the implication or the impact of whatever it is, whatever the therapeutic is, that has to be there from day one. Even we say, the small molecules should be easier to source, the chemicals. If you don't bring your team members along, because you can have a pivot, you can say, this is my traditional development plan, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. CMC are going to have their, CMC development plan, and they're going to have their lots and their batches created based off that. But if you find a biomarker and you think, actually, I have a pathway that can give me accelerated approval, that changes everything completely. So you need to bring in colleagues as early as possible. And this is why the TPP actually becomes quite important. But going back to the piece around the devices, I do think a lot of the devices I've worked on, and I don't mean this to be a sweeping generalization, but they've been developed by engineers. Engineers have had a pet project. They've got something they think, actually has an application here, which is wonderful. But they're missing what the clinical narrative would be, or what you need to get into, from a patient perspective as well. So I do think, if anything, any device that is being repurposed or is being leveraged, for a clinical indication, those conversations need to happen with that development team sooner rather than later. And we shouldn't just rely on real world evidence, because that comes with its own challenges as well. And I think, the stronger the evidence that you can generate in the development through the devices, the better it would be. I mean, that's the whole point of the MDR, the medical device regulation in Europe as well. They want to have the burden of evidence that they didn't have to do before. So I do think those discussions should happen earlier. How in depth they would be, or how much time do you need to take from those other colleagues, that would vary on where you are. But I think everyone needs to align to what that North Star is, and then actually, what does it mean for me, and what does it mean for my function? And I think that's the important piece. I think that's where the level setting needs to happen.
Absolutely. And coming back to whether we're talking about device, biologic, cell and gene, or small molecule, irrelevant relative to your earlier point on time. Every single developer in every one of these kinds of modalities or leadership structure is being pressured by their board to go faster. Can I do more with less? How do I optimize for time in the most meaningful way? And of course, there's, regulatory approaches to try to accelerate. There's development approaches to try to accelerate. Everyone's come up with, creative approaches, but I would personally argue that one of the things that slows teams down is that teaming dynamic, and that
Agree.
you can't bring in the right people. If you can't operate as, a cohesive unit, you can come up with all the greatest regulatory strategies, but you're not going to take advantage of everything in front of you, and you're going to slow yourself down. So how do you think about, the equation to optimize time relative to, what we're trying to build in an early stage biotech?
So I think it's just recognizing, the need to be agile, adaptable, and also knowing what your limitations are. So I think people need to understand what it is that you're driving towards. And as I said before, it's like, if they haven't been brought along with you, you're going to spend more time bringing them up to speed as one piece. If you have these novel approaches and these novel strategies, not everybody is going to be au fait with them, or people may feel uncomfortable. So I think, we just need to make sure that we reassure people that, this has been done before. I don't think there should be any shame in bringing external folks in to help you, because like we've said before, there's been an explosion in innovation, but only a handful of people have actually seen them through, to commercialization or whatever it may be. So there is a wealth of expertise out there as well. So I think it's knowing when to ask for help, and knowing what the gaps are. And I know this has come up in previous discussions you've had with other guests. From a CMO perspective, we're expected to be multiple different things, like the octopus as well. You can't be everything to everybody, but I think it's really important to understand what you can be and what you cannot be. And then what you cannot be is what you then pull in the help to support you with as well. So I think that from a CMO perspective, I think is important, which I think helps, because ultimately, if you want to get this, if this does make a difference, and, if it is going to help people, there should be you should be able to be open enough to acknowledge, what needs to be done and where you need extra help. But I do think that teaming component is extremely important. You don't want to offend or upset colleagues from other functions because they're going to be critical, for achieving certain milestones as well. So I think it's about just being as open and transparent as you can be as well.
Absolutely. When I think about these key themes, we're talking about, are you an early stage? Are you late stage? What modality do you align to? There's so many different flavors of leadership structures or leadership styles that make sense in a biotech. There's not one that's right or wrong. And if you have experience in one, but you want to learn another, I think there's plenty of opportunity for it, as long as you do lean into the team that you're developing around you, so that you can learn, but also accelerate and be able to get patients, medicines that they deserve.
Yeah. And I think the other thing as well is, you can have your own personal network as well. I think having people that have gone through this, whatever it may be, kind of your own little brain trust. And I don't think there's any shame in doing something like that. I think it's important to be able to know, obviously, you're not going to share confidential material, but if there is a place, or if there is a group of people that you could reach out to, or people can have discussions with, just as a gut check, a sanity check, it's never a bad idea. Depending on what the board composition is, you may have investors on there, but you may have scientists or other people that have been CSOs or CMOs. Leverage them, have separate meetings with them, discuss with them, pre-board meeting, whatever it may be, because there's never too much support around. There's more than you actually think, I guess, as well, especially if you're a first timer.
Absolutely. I think that is incredibly valuable advice that we should all be heeding in multiple capacities in our day-to-day. But Benit, it was so great to have you back on the show again. Thank you for joining and for all of the great thoughts here.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI Strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.